So once again, it's really an honor to welcome Prof. Omar Farahat in our seminar series. Prof is at Megal University. His research focus on Islamic legal and moral theory. His first book, which we have read and discussed thoroughly this year, is The Foundation of Norm in Islamic Jurisprudence and Theology, which explore the role of divine command as a source of normativity in classic Islamic thought. And the paper, which we will hear today, in many ways, it's somehow resonate with the book. With all due respect to Prof, you have the mic, you have 30 to 40 minutes, of course, and after that we take a question. Please.
Right. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. I saw the program for the seminar, and you know, it's an honor to be among those illustrious speakers that have spoken before me. And I was happy to see that there was an interest in my book early on in the seminar. As we agreed, I will keep my comments within the general framework of the book, and so hopefully you can I'll be happy to kind of be part of any conversations you had about the arguments of the book earlier in the seminar. And the paper is in fact a summary of some of the main arguments that I make in the first 3 chapters of the book. So there is nothing in the paper I circulated that is entirely new, except maybe some issues of framing and some conversations with some contemporary scholarship. So since I assume most of the participants had an opportunity to read and discuss the book and perhaps even look at the paper quickly, I will keep my comments fairly broad in terms of framing the arguments of the book, how they came to be, and some of the main interventions that I hope the book is making. So just as a background, this project started as a doctoral project, and initially I was what drove me to study this set of questions is a concern with a question of moral theory, which is how do we attain evaluative conclusions based on descriptive premises. That's essentially the question that I had in mind. And in the Islamic jurisprudential and theological context, it seemed to me that Islamic legal theory, usul al-fiqh, might be the right place to begin investigating this question. How do we, what kinds of, because we always start from, in legal reasoning, normally we start from factual observations, and then observations about legal sources, and then we attain specific evaluative conclusions or normative conclusions concerning the case at hand. And at the level of in the Islamic tradition, it seemed to me that investigating the question of divine commands might be precisely the correct place to try to figure out this question. The question is, broadly speaking, how can we attain knowledge of norms and values based on the our general experiences with legal sources, with our lived experiences, and so on. And a part of the Islamic tradition where it seemed to me this question is closely examined is how divine commands are presumed to give rise to specific types of normative judgments. But then once I started investigating this question, it became clear to me that I cannot do that without delving deeper into the theological foundations of these conversations. And this sort of dive into the theological foundations of the conversations is what ended up being the first half of this book, which essentially drove me to the frequently studied debate on the necessity of divine revelation, with familiar proponents of the view that that all Ashʿarī, which is kind of judgments, which is a term that mixes the legal and the moral. So all evaluative judgments from a Ashʿarī standpoint have to rest in some way on divine speech, on divine revelation, and the familiar proponents of that position, at least in the Sunni tradition, are the Ashʿarīs, and they have many interlocutors, but the most, at least in the texts that I studied, are the Muʿtaziʿlī, as well as some Shia thinkers, and there are some references to some non-Islamic schools that are not of very clear historical accuracy, so I don't delve much on that. There are references to Hindu arguments, for instance. But at any rate, so I found myself in this somewhat familiar territory, but I found that it was necessary for me to rethink some of those debates, some of the ways in which those debates tend to be framed. And one frequent way in which those debates are framed is framing the argument that we must in some way take into account divine revelation as an indication of traditionalism of sorts, that the insistence on relying on divine revelation is motivated primarily by pious motives, or motives that have to do with attachment to the text, as opposed to the alternative, which is the view that we're able to attain judgments independently of divine revelation, which is often referred to as the rationalist. And I think this dichotomy, well, it's a false dichotomy, because these aren't the only two ways of approaching the question of how do we reach normative judgments in the Islamic context, but it's also an inaccurate dichotomy, because it is imposed on the tradition. And it is imposed because it presumes a certain model of what it means to rely on divine revelation that, on careful reading of classical theological texts in the Islamic tradition, turns out not to be the dominant view, which is what I will discuss shortly. But also this question I think, has important contemporary implications, because for those of us who are deeply involved in political conversations in Muslim majority nations over the past decade or so, this polarity continues. The polarity between and the what I refer to as a false dichotomy is in fact advocated by all sides of the polarity as elements of identity, and in fact as political agendas. The Sharia-based versus the secularists who make the claim that freeing ourselves of textual authority is the way forward. But these are arguments that are based on, I think, a fairly shallow understanding of the tradition itself. And that's the point of, that's sort of the general environment in which this first part of the book was conceived. The framework within which we assume that following divine revelation is an act of pure obedience, is an act of deference to the will of a greater maker of rules, is not unheard of in classical Islamic theological debates, but it's more, it's not as central as many assume it to be. And it seems to carry within it some non-Muslim assumptions about what it means for God to speak to us and what it means for us to follow divine speech. And these assumptions seem to me tend to, we take too much from the Christian tradition, especially the Christian tradition of natural law, in assuming that there is an identity between the foundations or the moral dynamics that would lead God to make commands and the way in which we perceive what is right and what is good from a human perspective. And that already is, I think, is assuming too much, because this was an open question in the Islamic tradition. And I would venture that the Ash'arīs, being not exactly a marginal force in Islamic history, advanced a project in which that does not rely on this model of divine command, that does not conceive of divine command as the authoritative expressions of the will of a being that is in a way, a father figure or a supreme, a human-like being that simply knows better than we do, and therefore informs us of what is in our best interest. That is not what the classical Ash'arīs, meaning the major figures of the 11th century, which is the period around which my interest focused. This is not the model that we find in the reasoning. And so much of what I did there was to essentially put together this model. And in putting it together, it became clear to me that essentially the main guiding theme in the Ash'arī theology of that time was the argument that divine revelation cannot be replaced, meaning that the heritage that we are left with based on the mission of Prophet Muhammad precisely is not, and particularly, is not replaceable by any other source of moral knowledge. It is unique, and it has to continue to play the same role in legal and moral reasoning, regardless of the lapse of time. But that, again, this might sound like, it's a rigid view, but when we actually delve into the theology, we see that there is a clear difference between how classical Ash'arīs framed their insistence on the divine revelation and how, for example, a modern traditionalist would frame the same argument. So the idea being that Ash'arīs, in framing their arguments, they framed it in an intellectually complicated, and they did it at many levels in conversation with their contemporary opponents, or those are differing views, and that gave us an edifice of what we would refer to today as a kind of term of art, divine command theory, that a view is really worth investigating because it really sets itself apart from the simplistic view that we just have to follow what God says because God is a figure of authority that we have to follow. That is not really what we see here. So, but before I sort of sum up the main features of this model, which you're probably familiar with from reading the book, I want to say that I think this argument is also, even though I don't advance it as a question of Islamic intellectual or political history, I think it does have a potential of informing Islamic political and intellectual history because, well, the question of what happens to the event of revelation over time is a fairly central and foundational question to the Muslim community. Being, if we accept that the Muslim community is a community that was, its very existence was triggered by the mission of Prophet Muhammad, and that carried forward the application, the practical implications of this mission over time as its very fundamental reason for being in the first place, then settling the issue of whether we have to continue to, what kind of tie to this event should carry forward in time is a fairly important question. It's a question of political importance. It's a question of importance with regards to identity. And so to me, even though I'm not a political historian, it makes sense that this would be the guiding principle of a major intellectual project like the Ashʿarī theology, as well as being the issue of contention in the work of their opponents. So that is to say that when there's a tendency to reduce these debates, for example, to debates about moral realism, I think this is one side of it, but this is sort of missing the big picture. The big picture is not that the Ashʿarīs really detested the idea that that actions can have inherent moral values. They disagreed with that view, but they disagreed with that view because it didn't fit into the broader understanding of the place of divine revelation in the moral life of the community, not for its own sake, not just for technical reasons. All right, so let's one last remark is that taking this broader view also means that sometimes we will find within these traditions arguments that may not fit perfectly together. For example, if you insist that the Ashʿarīs argued that as a matter of ontology, as a matter of moral ontology, actions may not have inherent moral values, which they did, you might be questioning the fact that it's valuable for them to make an argument based on epistemology, based on the fact that the human mind is incapable of conceiving of moral values that are of a universal or universalizable nature, because, well, if our own sense experience is entirely devoid of such universalizable moral judgment, then it would follow that that you might think that the ontological argument would be sufficient. And so why did they make both an ontological and an epistemological argument? Because both arguments were ways of advancing the same ultimate view of the world and the same ultimate view of ethics. And they were, we know at this point in time that these traditions evolved in dialogical ways. So they were advancing their views in conversation with the claims that they disagreed with. And so the idea of having one unified theory within which everything is articulated perfectly is not as important as being able to systematically debate and respond to arguments that do not advance their ultimate view, which is the view that, as I said, the revelation or the heritage left to us as a result of the mission of Muhammad is unique, irreplaceable, cannot be repeated, and therefore this link with that mission must be maintained. Okay, so what are some of the main arguments that we find here? And I'll try to, I'm already close to 20 minutes. I'll try to keep it brief so we can have as much discussion as possible. I think that the most important entry point in that project is the epistemological argument. And I say that because when we look at the actual structure of classical theological treatises, more often than not, I would say in the vast majority of cases, they begin with discussions of epistemology. And so they viewed the world as a collection of knowables, of things that have the potential of being known. And so the advancing a theory of knowledge was a critical point in distinguishing the two sides of the debate. And I think it's not often stressed that the classical Ashʿarī view of knowledge was, in fact, was in a way advanced a very robust view of the ways in which we acquire factual knowledge. So for them, acquiring factual knowledge in using empirical methods, using sense perception, has to actually align with objective reality. So it's not enough for something to qualify as knowledge, for us to have a representation of it in our minds, but true knowledge has to be verifiable. And because they had this robust view of the way the human mind can actually reach conclusions about the world, they excluded from this realm of certainty our knowledge that is of evaluative nature. So because we cannot verify the truthfulness of claims that are of normative or evaluative nature, like, you know, usury is reprehensible, or sharing your wealth is laudable, or what have you. Judgments of that nature cannot be gleaned from sense perception. So something else has to be present in order for us to be able to reach conclusions of that nature. And that's, again, that brings me back to the first question that I started with, which is, how do we reach conclusions of this normative nature when all we have are sort of the workings of our own mind and experiences of the world? And so because they found that it's epistemologically impossible for individual human beings to reach conclusions of that nature that are verifiably universalizable, and because our experience of the world, that the world itself is the consistency of the world is a reflection of divine habit, that it's divine habit of consistency that produces the appearance of consistency for us within the world. And because the way this is set up does not allow us insight into moral knowledge from a divine perspective, from a universal perspective, therefore an interruption of this process is necessary for that kind of ethics to be even available to our mind, and is precisely the interruption of that process that they refer to as miracle or ijaz. So this is the epistemological aspect of the discussion. The opponents viewed that that by reaching a state of inner conviction, we can be fairly certain that our knowledge is in fact true and aligned with the truth of the world. And so based on that more relaxed understanding of epistemology, they reached the conclusion that, well, when you inwardly reached a place of conviction, for example, that hoarding has negative moral value, whereas distributing wealth has a positive moral value, then you can be sure that this is actually true. The same way when you are observing, a color or emotion, you can be sure that it's actually true because you reached a certain state of conviction. Okay, so moving on to the next level, which is the ontological level. And here, the Ash'arīs maintained a sort of radical divide between the nature of the divine and everything else. So for them, only the divine is above time, is unchanging, is eternal, and everything else is within time, created and destined to end, and constantly changing in constant flux. And so we cannot really, it would be absurd to attempt to base stable moral knowledge based on these phenomena that are in a constant state of flux. And so the moral implication of that is that we cannot assume, because there's no parallel between the divine creator and the human or other creation in the universe at large, then we cannot draw parallels between our own moral observations, our own judgments about what is good and bad from our own subjective viewpoint, and what would be considered good or bad or right or wrong from a more categorical universal standpoint. So this sort of large divide is an important step from a moral perspective, because it makes it unlikely to be able to reach reliable moral conclusions based on our own assessment of what seems good or bad. And so finally, and this is, to me, this is the most complex part of their view, which I don't know if, I don't actually settle this in any way in the book, is, well, how do we bridge the gap? Wouldn't this ontological combination of epistemological skepticism and ontological flux, or kind of a process view of the world, lead to renunciation of ethics altogether? If our brains are incapable of making general judgments beyond our own limited experience, and if the world is constantly changing, then wouldn't it be reasonable to say that, well, there's no such thing as ethics, there is no such thing as proper behavior, let's just follow our subjective interests, and that should be good enough? Well, the answer here is a little bit complicated, because we do witness the miracle, which is the event of revelation, which to them triggers an obligation to investigate, at least to those classical Ash'arīs like Juwayni, for example, triggers an obligation upon all rational human beings to investigate the nature and implications of that event of revelation. But then again, our experience of the event of revelation is a purely limited human experience that is also limited by the ontological and epistemological aspects that have been previously discussed, whereas proper divine speech, unlike the Muʿtaziʿlī, Shi'i, Christian way of approaching it, is not an expression of divine will any more than anything else in the world is an expression of divine will. The Ashʿarīs famously believed that God wills everything, including things that may be perceived by us as unfortunate or even evil. So the revelation is not an expression of divine will in that limited sense, in the sense that God observes, our behavior and then tells us what to do. Revelation is a reflection of divine speech, which is a different attribute than the attribute of will, which is an eternal attribute that is co-eternal with God. And there's a whole theological debate there about, in the response to those who argued that divine attributes are one with God. So their solution to that was that divine attributes are co-eternal with God, and that includes divine speech. And our experience of revelation is an experience of an eternal divine attribute. But then how do we solve the problem of our necessary epistemological limitation and the fact that everything is in flux? So when you, and this is an argument that Al-Juwayni makes, when you read or listen to the Quran at point T, that's a different experience from reading or listening to the Quran at point T+1 or at point T+2. Every experience is a new experience. There is no, you cannot step in the same river twice. And so how do we resolve this? The closest I found to an attempt to resolve this problem that I found is the argument in Juwayni and also Baqillani that legal reasoning is an act of worship. So the same way we pray to God, and sort of there is a sense of divinity in our being as we conduct this act of worship. God isn't actually present in the prayer. Our prayer is not the act of prayer is not identical with God, or is not divine in itself. It's a purely human exercise, but it is sort of geared towards the divine. This is the same for them thing that scholars do when they perform legal reasoning. Performing legal reasoning is an act that is geared towards the ideal of divine speech, but we cannot really attain divine speech. We can only grapple with the words of revelation, and that in itself is an act of worship. So I can think of some ways of trying to respond to that argument, but I'll leave it at that for now. I'll just conclude that what I try to do in the book, as those of you who've read it would be aware, is to put together these different stages of the Ashʿarī argument to show that, well, the idea that they simply were piously and stubbornly insisting on divine revelation is just not true. This is the product of very elaborate and complicated philosophical debates. And the second thing, so I sort of put together this set of arguments without trying to trace a history of Ashʿarī thought. So there is a lot that goes on with later scholars, especially after Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, that is not part of this project, but of course it's of great importance and interest, and I think it's a positive thing that there are many works at the moment that are focused on post-classical scholars. But also the other thing that this sort of reconstruction of this arguments does is that it allows us to see that in fact, within the Islamic legal tradition, there was what we would term a coherent divine command theory. And divine command theorists within incomparable traditions, for example, like in the Christian tradition, in fact, attempt to make similar arguments to this, attempt to separate, attempt to say, because they are faced with the so-called Euthyphro problem that, you know, either divine commands or tell us what is already good and therefore they're superfluous, or things are good because God commanded them, which makes them arbitrary. And to try to escape this this dilemma, some of the modern divine command theorists precisely attempt to separate the concept of right and good from a divine perspective from the concept of right and good from human perspective, and to say, you know, these are two different normative orders. There is the right and good, and I think this is an attempt to escape the second horn of the divine, of the Euthyphro dilemma, that just because we cannot verify moral judgments that are anchored in divine revelation on purely human grounds doesn't make them arbitrary. They're just different. They're occurring at a different level of normativity, whereas we have our own sort of subjective hypothetical judgments that could serve our interests. We can make judgments about, you know, when you see somebody inflicting unnecessary suffering on a living being, you can say that, well, this is bad because suffering is bad. But this is a different way of thinking about judgments than the way of thinking about moral judgments that is anchored in divine revelation. And so I think Ash'aris, and also to some extent Maturidis, who are of great interest to some contemporary divine command theorists, are a very helpful resource for those contemporary theological ethicists who wish to advance views that try to escape these familiar set of objections to divine command theories. So much of this will be familiar to those of you who have had a chance to read the book. So I'm going to stop here, and I look forward to your thoughts.
So thank you very, very much, Professor Farahat. I don't want to spend too much apologizing for my mishap earlier this morning, but really a great pleasure to listen to you and also share with us, I think, the basic, you know, your argument, as well as, in addition, you also gave us a very good contextual background in the beginning, in the first part, you know, to think about the broader questions that address, firstly, you know, not only Muslims, but I mean, first thinking about the dilemmas or maybe the challenges facing Muslims to think about ethics, and also I think your contribution to, you know, unpacking the theological ethics in the way that you've done in your book, and also beautifully summarized in this paper, I think really makes a good, significant contribution that we will think about for a long time, and it's really great to thank you very much for making yourself available so that we can have this conversation. I also think in the second part where you unpacked it, I mean, it's also, you know, succinctly presented. I was actually thinking how you're going to do that in one paper, but you've really done quite well in terms of, you know, bringing together the main arguments as well. So as we usually do, we'll open up with some, you know, questions and comments. Everybody is welcome to do that. If you have the capacity, your internet capacity, to make yourself visible, and it's also nicer to have a conversation when we can see each other. I see Muhammad Fadil already ready to ask the question, I assume.
I didn't raise my hand, but
yeah, no, you didn't, but thanks very much for you making yourself available on view as well. So I'm inviting everybody to join the discussion with comments and questions. I have got a lot of them, but I'm going to reserve my chair's right for the moment. So I see Professor Mariam Al-Attar has got a hand up. invite her to join the conversation. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farahat, for this interesting presentation. Actually, I read your book when it first came out, and I was very much interested in reading like how you are going to go about that. And I kind of saw that there was an attempt to ground morality not simply in divine commands, as some of the Ash'arites would argue, but in the divine purposes or in divine attributes. But you know what, I have like some comments first, and then I have a question for you as well. First of all, when you say that the main purpose of the Ash'arites is to defend the importance and of the divine revelation, and that it is not replaceable, and that it is needed for legislation and for morality. But let me tell you something, and I'm sure you are aware of that, even the Mu'tazilah, they were like pious people, they were very religious. And for a very long time, they were the only Muslim theologians around, since, as you know, the Ash'arī only left the Mu'tazilah when he was 40 years old, and that was in the 10th century. So before that, it was the Mu'tazilite theology that prevailed, and maybe there was some influence from Christianity or from other traditions, which is something also the Ash'arites had as well. They were also influenced by philosophy, especially the late Mu'tazilites, if you are talking about Fakhruddin al-Razi and even al-Ghazali before him, of course. So I would say that even the Mu'tazilah were also very much interested in defending the fact that the revelation is not replaceable, although they held some views which contradict the views of the Ash'arite about the nature of good and evil, and they thought that we are able to know certain moral values by reason without the aid of revelation, and they kind of defended the human capacity to know what is right and what is wrong, sometimes independently without revelation. But they never said, and no Muslim would ever say, that what we have in the Quran, what is received by revelation, in any way contradicts what we can know by reason. And I think that the concept of al-fitra, which is very well known in for those of you who speak Arabic, the concept al-fitra itself says that we have that capacity maybe by nature, or as you have actually referred to when you talked about reaching the state of inner conviction to distinguish between what is right and what is wrong. And by the way, I will ask you the question is related about that, but also another very small remark, Dr. Omar, allow me to say that, but you mentioned that the Mu'tazilite, Shiite, and Christian approach, and you kind of compared that to the true or Ash'arite Islamic approach, but then later on you actually mentioned the divine command theorist in the Christian tradition. So you are very much aware that we cannot put Mu'tazila and Shia and Christians all together and think that they all followed kind of natural law theory, because also in Christianity, almost all the Protestant tradition, they follow different types of divine command theory, and they are trying to develop their understanding of divine command theories. Many of them are trying, and they have very different views on how to develop understanding of divine command theory. So my question is actually, when you mentioned that reaching the state of inner conviction, and I think you give us the example about the accumulation of wealth and the distribution of wealth, and that you can know what is the right thing, that, or if I understood you wrong, I don't know, but I understood that even the Ash'arites would agree that that state of inner conviction is kind of the criteria for the truth of normative judgments that can allow us to distinguish between accumulating wealth for no reason and distributing wealth in a just way. So is that true? Did the Mu'tazilite actually think so? Or were they actually arguing against this position? And thank you. Sorry for being too long, Dr. Tayyub.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you very much. I think it's sort of, yeah, please go ahead, Professor Farahat.
All right, thank you. I will address each comment one by one. So the Mu'tazilis also were pious people who defended the necessity of revelation. Yes, my argument is not about the historical actual belief of any specific historian. My argument is about the conceptual implications of different systems of thought. Of course, the Mu'tazilis were there is nothing in my arguments that is designed or intended to make any judgment about anyone's piety. This is precisely the point. The point is that this is not about who is more attached to revelation. This is more about theoretical ethics and what are the possible, conceivable, logical conclusions of different types of arguments. So, and in fact, it is mentioned in the book that Abdul Jabbar and some of those who follow him do advance arguments as to why we need a revelation. But the point is that, and so their point is that even though judgments that follow from divine revelation do align with judgments that could be reached through human reasoning, the revelation that does not make revelation superfluous. Revelation is necessary because there are some areas that may be too obscure or may have been historically missed. But the point is that theoretically speaking, there is a distinction between the moral implications of these two systems of thought. That even though the Mu'tazila never made the claim that divine revelation could be replaced by another system in these exact words, the logical conclusion of saying that the human minds have the potential of attaining categorical moral judgments was, at least from the Ash'ari point of view, seen to potentially lead to that conclusion, that we could have a purely naturalist system of ethics that may be confirmed by revelation, but that would sort of be from their perspective, that would be an undesirable conclusion. Not that the Mu'tazilis actually made it, and that has nothing to do with anyone's piety. The other thing is, no Muslim would say that what we can know in the Quran contradicts what we know by reason. Yes, the Ash'aris would say that. They wouldn't say that it contradicts it, but they would say that we don't need to confirm judgments that are derived from divine revelation through revelation independent judgments. So if there is a contradiction, that just goes to show that we are incapable of grasping the truth of the world and the truth of ethics from a universal standpoint. And so I don't think that maybe I misunderstood this statement, but I do think that the classical Ash'aris would have no problem saying that there could be a contradiction between judgments made by human reason and judgments made through divine revelation, and this is just because we have no way of understanding God's designs in a comprehensive way. Also, I never said that Ash'ari approach is the true Islamic approach, and this is a point that I made, in the book, that this is this debate is internal to the Islamic tradition. What I was saying is that there is a specific conception there is a specific natural law conception that could be found in the Mu'tazilah and in some aspects of, so I'm simply drawing a parallel between the natural law traditions in different intellectual traditions to show that the Ash'arīs, but this divide is also found within the Christian tradition, as you correctly pointed out. And so this is why it's interesting, as you said, to align. There has been work in the past that aligned the Mu'tazilah with the natural law scholars of Christianity. There isn't enough work that aligns the Ash'arīs with the divine command theorists in other traditions. So that was just my point. On the state of inner conviction, yes, I think there is a clarification that's necessary here. The Mu'taziļī view is that the state of inner conviction, independently of revelation, so sukun al-nafs, the tranquility of the self, is a sufficient condition for reaching universal moral knowledge. So if I am a person of sound mind and I exercise my rational faculties correctly, and I reach the conclusion that hitting a cat for no reason is categorically evil, then this is just the truth. This is the objective reality, and we know it's the objective reality because our mind reaches this state of conviction that does not allow for any possible contradiction. The Ash'arīs wouldn't agree to this. They would say, well, we have to ask, we have to ask for historical, cultural, contextual information, that every revelation independent judgment is subjectively grounded and so on. But they will say that reasoning based on revelation, yes, it's a probabilistic kind of reasoning, and scholars have to reach a certain degree of conviction and so on. But then that becomes a question of revelation-based legal theory. So it's I should have probably clarified that. So thank you for the question. That these are two different discussions, I think.
Not muted. Sorry. Just make sure that I'm not muted. Thank you very much for that. There's Muhammad Khalid Masood has just, I see he said two hands, but he has just raised some questions that perhaps also get to the of your topic. Professor Masood, do you want to come in there, or should I just read your questions? You unmute yourself.
You can read it.
Yes, no, we can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Okay. First, I thank you very much. I joined late. My question is that in this debate, there is a phrase used, قبل ورود الشرع. So what is the significance of this in this debate particularly? And also, what's the significance and the implication for the Mu'tazilah? Because are they responding to the Ash'arī, or they are just confirming their own view? And my second question in the same is, do they differ with the Ash'arīs on Nasikh and Mansukh?
All right, thank you very much. Some of this is a little beyond, strictly beyond the range of the study. But what I will say on this is, well, the قبل ورود الشرع is a question that is to be found in there is the famous book by Kevin Reinhardt on this issue called Before Revelation, where it's discussed from a legal theory. standpoint, and he explains at length the divisions between different legal schools on that issue. But the way it plays out here, in as far as I can see, is in the question of well, if we reframe this question to what can we know independently of revelation, then it becomes directly relevant to the debate. So what we can know independently of revelation for the Mu'tazilah is very different from what we can know independently of revelation for the Ashʿarī. What we can know independently of revelation for the Mu'tazilah is there's a lot of potential for true moral reasoning independently of revelation, even if for many reasons, for many practical reasons, we may not, or the human communities may not have reached a point where they reach true moral knowledge independently of divine revelation. But the potential of reaching moral judgments that are true and verifiable independently or prior to revelation is certainly present and affirmed by the Mu'tazilah. And for the Ash'aris, the claim here would be that prior to revelation, we have no moral obligation other than the obligation of investigating the potential, the veracity of messages from prophets. So there is one kind of purely rational obligation that is independent of revelation and prior to revelation, and I think it's logically inevitable that there would be a purely rational obligation that is independent of revelation, and that's the obligation to investigate revelation. So when there's a messenger that is supported by miracle, then there is a duty for them to investigate revelation, and once we encounter miracle, then we are held responsible to it moving forward. But before the arrival of miracle, we're still sort of we're still bound by the limits of our own subjective reasoning. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, can I extend that? I just want to confirm with you, because it was really explaining with revelation. I'm trying to understand it, that if we understand Shara as a system of law rather than revelation, so can there be a good and bad in the meaning of law before the system, legal system, or outside the legal system?
For the Ash'aris, outside the legal system, there is only a good or bad in the subjective sense. So there is only something can be good for something. So, and this Ghazali addresses in his Mustasfa. So there can be a good, it is good to have this conversation because it's good for our own personal edification. But if we want to say that it's good from the legal standpoint, then we can only make this claim based on divine revelation. We cannot make it independently of it.
Now, what I'm asking is it possible to look at it as that the real question was not the revelation, but the legal system? That if there is no legal system, there is no legal obligation.
I think that's a valid way of putting it. Yes. So I mean, when I say universal or categorical or a true moral knowledge, that is sort of equivalent to Shari, which could be understood as pertaining to this particular legal system. So yes, outside of the Shari type of judgment for them, there is no possibility of certain objective evaluative knowledge. I would agree with that way of putting it.
Yeah, because modern legal system, you cannot say that this is law unless it is legislated, unless it's codified. Right. So
yes,
maybe we can see that the Ashʿarī had a point there, and the Muʿtaziļī are not differentiating between the natural law and the legislated law?
There are so many things going on here, and I don't want to take up too much time, but a lot of the, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the motivations of this project was to try to think through questions of, well, what kind of legality would be coherent and practicable from, even though I don't really get to this point in the book, but this was sort of in the background. And one of the motivations of this is to say that it's possible to have a functional type of legality that is based on divine revelation, but even within that type of legality, there is always a place for natural law reasoning. So going back to Professor Al-Attar's comment, I wouldn't say that the Ashʿarī model is a valid one. I think even in state-based legal systems, there is always a back and forth. And this also an answer to a question that you asked. Yes, they always develop their arguments against one another. And even in a purely state-based secular legal system, you always have a back and forth between the positivists and the naturalists. And I think this is inevitable. This is how legal systems operate. The problem we have today is that these approaches are seen as mutually exclusive. So each kind of the proponent of each model wants to sort of eliminate the proponent of the other model. Whereas, as I mentioned in the last section of my book, natural law-like ideas were very much alive and well in the framework of the mature usul al-fiqh. But that's maybe a conversation for another time.
My second question was about Nasir and Mansur.
This is a bit.
Yeah, please go ahead. All right, I just thought. Okay, please go ahead with that. Yeah.
No, I'm just going to say that this is not directly addressed in my work, and I haven't really given it much thought. So maybe we'll be in touch about that later.
Thank you very much. I think that exchange was quite useful. We'll perhaps we can come back to some of its implications. But I'm going to ask Aslam to come in now. Aslam.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for Professor Farahat for your book and for your lecture. It was really great food for thought. So I think the question that's been bothering me is really the fact that, the classical intellectual tradition, the Islamic tradition that you deal with substantially in your book, the Ashʿarites and the Muʿtaziļites, like you allude to, they don't really problematize the question of transcendence. Revelation is not really a problem. There's these debates on reason and revelation, but it's not problematized. But when we come to our context and a post-Kantian worldview, where Kant has a problem with knowing a thing in itself, he's essentially rejecting any kind of experiential or essential knowledge, and he's giving us this idea of a categorical imperative, trying to reach an understanding of ethics and values based simply on reason. What do you make of these kind of arguments in helping us to understand the status of values in a contemporary context? I mean, you've spoken about, the epistemological side and the ontological side, but I mean, what do we do with revelation? To put it simply, is it something that we can regard as an Islamic thing in itself? Does it have an ontological status? I mean, for me, this is a big question that I'm trying to grapple with. I was just wanting to hear some of your thoughts on that.
No, thank you. This is a great question, and it's also, I agree, it's a big question that I'm also trying to grapple with, and I don't know if I have a solution, but I would say that the way it was not resolved, but conceived of, the way this problem was conceived of, and this in a way relates to what I saw as a problem in the third part of my talk, in that, well, how do you make the leap between, if you sort of disentangle divine reason from human reason, and you say that these are two separate things, well, why don't you just go all the way and say there is simply no ethics? You know, we cannot make moral judgments based on sort of a priori knowledge as we would in a Kantian world, or we cannot make moral judgments based on intuition as we would according to some Mu'tazilah, or based on realist views. And so why don't we just say, I mean, it is a problem that if revelation, they're trying to solve the natural law pitfalls of potential ultimate replaceability of revelation by completely assuming a radical divide between the divine and the human. And so how do we make that work? One model that seems to me to arise from the classical tradition is essentially anchoring moral judgments based on revelation in a sort of social agreement. So morality becomes a socially constructed, or the legal system, Sharia, becomes a socially constructed effort. So the miracle triggers the community. The community carries on with it this sort of event, this sort of miraculous event that is constitutive, foundational of this community. Every community needs a founding story, and this is the founding story of the Muslim community. It's a community that was triggered by miracle, as embodied in the mission of Prophet Muhammad. And so practical reasoning becomes the purview of this community as a whole. And so actual moral judgments, even though they are not direct one-to-one representations of divine speech, they do have a certain sense of moral authority because they are the collective effort of the community of scholars that are representatives of the community of believers whose own reason for being a community in the first place is the event of revelation. So at the end, ultimately, moral judgments become a matter of social construction, but it's not entirely arbitrary social construction, because it is a kind of social construction that is mandated by the belief in the miraculous and truthful nature of the message of Prophet Muhammad. I don't directly make this claim in the book, and I don't know. I imagine that this sort of, as we think through the alternatives to the kind of centralized state model, what other kind of governance could there be? This is one potential way of thinking about it, is that law should be, one of the crises in much of the Muslim majority world is the disjunction between political authority, which monopolizes lawmaking, and the beliefs and values and aspirations of much of the populations, many of which tend to be informed by Islamic values and Islamic ideas. And so perhaps this is a viable way of thinking about founding moral and legal judgments, anchoring them in a sort of living community that engages with divine revelation. but again, this is just a tentative answer. I don't know if I have a fully developed response.
I think those are good ideas to think about. I was just thinking whether, just before I hand over to Muhammad Fadil, the point of thinking about revelation, which plays such a central role. But if one thinks about revelation, specifically in the broader context of what the Quran speaks about revelation, I mean, I was wondering, my question would be that what is the nature of mu'jiza? We know that the major mu'jiza is the Quran, but one can also speak about the ayats in the Quran as opening up the door to thinking about revelation, perhaps, using the basis of the Ashʿarī and of the scholars in the medieval times that had developed this point, but one can broaden that notion of revelation in a way to expand the scope and still hold on to obviously to the idea of the experience of miracles, or the experience of maybe, for want of a better term, genius, or the idea that how does one account for the fact that that you have human insights that are sort of very special, that come from certain individuals and peoples. So rather than just saying, okay, this is a community, and so therefore this would be their morality, which obviously from the perspective of a Kantian or a universal ethics, that's not ethics, that's just morality. And I think the question is, once you introduce the kind of deliberative engagements in theology and Islamic law that you've introduced in your work, I think one cannot simply go back to saying, okay, it's this community with its own morality, and so therefore it doesn't have the kind of deliberative or rational reflection that goes in there. I'm just speaking about the generalized perspective of how people sometimes distinguish between ethics and morality. But I think your book shows that you can have ethics, you have ethical reflection in a very, very fairly considerate in terms of thinking, in terms of what the Platonic or the Hellenic tradition that they sort of that they had encountered, and how they thought about questions of morality from that perspective. Sorry, I was just going to make a short comment, but I wanted to tie this idea about miracles as a sort of a linchpin. It's a very important point of not leaving it, and how does one think about that going forward?
Yes, thank you. That's very helpful.
Muhammad Fadil, please.
Thank you, Abdul Qadir. Thank you, Omar, for your very stimulating presentation. It raises just so many questions, and including the very last exchange. I was thinking of maybe abandoning my original question and following up on that discussion, but I'm going to restrain myself from that temptation. I think I wanted to ask a question starting from where you sort of left off the third part of your presentation, and tie it back to, I think, what you talked about, the motivation for your interest in studying Ash'arism generally. I think in the third part, if I understood you properly, you're saying that in the Ash'ari conception, it's not as though fidelity to revelation occupies the field in the sense that it eliminates the possibility of human evaluative judgments of acts, but it kind of tells us that human evaluations of the human evaluations of the ethical value of acts are going to be qualified and relative. And so that if you want to have a proper conception, a true conception of the ethical content of acts, revelation is indispensable, right? And so that gives us, it rehabilitates the Ash'aris insofar as it rescues them from a kind of primitive fidelity, right? I'm not sure how much it helps. Us in our contemporary debate is not that there's a kind of battle between fideists and a kind of nuanced commitment to revelation in the way that the Mu'tazilah advocated, for example. I mean, if it were that, then I think it could be much more soluble. But it seems instead and I guess this isn't really central to the paper, but it seems instead that there's an alternative conception of religion entirely, which wants it to be entirely private, right? And that, it doesn't really matter whether you're a Mu'taziļī or Ashʿarī, because both Mu'tazilis and Ashʿarī are still committed to this idea that religion is communal in a very important way, that there's a fundamentally social dimension to religion in Islam. And this seems to me the line of conflict in the Arab world, maybe the Muslim world generally, in which you have a group of people, I don't genuinely know if they're secularists or not, like in a real sense, but they do seem to me to be genuinely committed to the idea that religion should have nothing to say to me other than what I want it to say to myself, right? And so any kind of conception of revelation in which it would provide an external criteria for judgment is absolutely rejected, right? And so I'm not sure how useful this project will be from that perspective, aside from, I mean, obviously it's very intellectually interesting, and for that reason, I'm very much engaged with it. But I'm just wondering if there's real political saliency, especially in light of the fact is, and you and I have discussed this, just the general indifference among educated moderns toward the Islamic tradition, right, seems to be an insuperable problem, regardless of the content of what the tradition is. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I mean, I agree with your characterization of the divide, and well, does it have political saliency? I don't know if at this particular point in time, much of what we do has political saliency, just given the sort of given the way things are politically. But I would agree that it's not like a rehabilitation of the divine command models of thinking would solve the problem. That far from it. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. A similar project could be done to sort of rehabilitate Mu'taziļī thought from the way it's caricatured in sort of a self-proclaimed secularist discourse that the sort of Mu'tazilah grant the key to precisely what you described, as a religion as purely subjective, as a matter of individual introspection, that what you can sort of once you reach a certain inner conviction about a certain judgment, then it is only valid for yourself, and so on. Of course, this is a misrepresentation of the Mu'taziļī view. But I think the way that the idea of relying on revelation is advanced by both sides of the divide is deeply flawed, and so I don't know if my project solves anything, but I know that it's important to correct this flaw. Perhaps there's another book to be written about how Mu'taziļī thought is misused. Yeah, this kind of question brings up sort of in a way, a sense of helplessness. I can't imagine what could be sort of done intellectually to shake up such intensely complex and almost seemingly hopeless conditions. But what I can say is, advancing something, advancing a view of, we have to debate in some manner the question of the place of divine revelation in the public sphere, in public discourse, in the rational argumentation. If somebody makes a claim about constitutional structure based on some revelation-based understanding, well, they shouldn't be immediately silenced, the same way that they shouldn't be taken to be a spokesperson for God either. So trying to initiate a conversation on these issues and advancing, showing that it is possible to advance a model that is theoretically functional, even if today it might not be practicable, is a step in sort of trying to think through this polarization. But yeah, I don't know.
If I could just follow up briefly, just very briefly, I agree 100% that this project is very useful for those elements of society that still imagine some kind of Islamic normativity in their social and political lives. The problem is that it seems to me that there's a fundamental divide about whether there should be any kind of Islamic Arab content to political normativity. And perhaps if it weren't, maybe if the Islamic side weren't as crude as it was in many ways, it might serve to bridge this gap. But I'm increasingly convinced that that's not really the case. But that's for another discussion. But so anyway, I just wanted to say that no need to be so politically despondent, because I think it is very helpful for that wing of the debate. I'm just wondering if it has any impact on the other side.
Yeah, I mean that's a big question, and I doubt it. But again, the reason why it might not have any impact is beyond intellectual coherence. It's a question that has to do with the way our societies are configured in a post-colonial context, the way social classes were shaped, and the way identities were shaped, and these things are tend to be resistant to intellectual work. I think from what I've seen, in the 2 years since the book was published, in that side of the debate, the reaction was simply silence or indifference to the book, or I just like being cut out of the standard secularist conversations because it's simply you don't fit in. So those divides, I think, are not determined by theoretical coherence. They are determined by much more material considerations. But you're right that this shouldn't deter anybody from advancing and producing theoretical work.
Thank you very much. I must say that I find that your book and the book, and I think we need many more studies like these, very close studies about the kind of deliberation that goes into theological texts, which I agree with you, the divine command theory has been such a dominant framework that is placed on that. And I think your book certainly, opens up the questions and, reflect of thinking about these, the kind of reflections, even though I think that the link between what was happening there and what is happening now, because now we have to think about, modernity, the questions of, like Aslam raised question of Kantian ethics, or, what I saw in your paper was also kind of a, if I'm looking at it from sort of a modernist perspective, there's sort of a utilitarian or ethics that actually is going on at some level. But at the same time, I think you've raised the question about, the question of revelation and miracle. I think those are fundamental questions that we need more of, and I think that we have to leave it to qada and qadar. I think these things will, the more we write about this, I think that it will have an impact, and that's what we've been trying to do with our series of lectures, as such, to have conversations going on as such. So I'm sure there are a lot of questions, but we've gone through about an hour and a half. So I'm just wondering whether, I've got a few questions as well, but I'm just wondering, I mean, we've taken a lot of your time already, and I hope that we can continue the conversation, and rather than trying to put it into one seminar. I mean, I think that, some of my questions are to do with, I mean, maybe if I could just pose one and so invite maybe one or two last ones to come up as such. I mean, what I got a sense, obviously, from your paper and from your book, is this kind of, the addressability, the question of, the Ash'arites are developing their positions against the Mu'taziליtes, and then vice versa. So there is this constant, going back and forth as such. I'm wondering whether, we can actually, begin to think about a kind of a debate and deliberation, whether it is a particular, maybe it is a locality, or is it a, much broader context within which these ideas developed over time as such. So to what extent, and I mean, you've somehow alluded to that, but, to what extent were the Maturidis, or perhaps even the Salafis, or somebody like Ibn Taymiyyah, what is his contribution to that? I've seen recently, the idea of the Ibn Taymiyyah as being the arch representative of the divine command theory is very easily jettisoned as soon as you look at his work as such. So I'm asking about the future work in terms of to what extent can we begin to think about this as a development of a discourse, as a continuing discourse and a debate going through as such going forward.
The way I understand it, these are two questions. So there's the issue of kind of the broader context, and there are other, obviously there are other sides of the debates that are not captured in the book, and there are later developments and also earlier debates that are not captured in the book. And there is also the question of whether there is this is sort of designed as a continuing conversation. Did I understand correctly?
Yes,
that there are two questions.
Yeah.
So I am sort of almost painfully aware of the fact that, and this is something I mentioned in the introduction, that this particular project takes a much less historicist approach than much of the work that is done on the Islamic intellectual tradition, essentially. And I rely on theories of text and theories of reading to sort of justify this stance that texts, yes, all texts are historically grounded, and our reading of them is historically grounded, but at the same time, texts have a universal tendency, and so it's always possible to approach a text either as a historian or as a philosopher or theologian. In that case, ideally both, but I lean towards the moral theologian approach than the intellectual historian approach in that particular project, precisely because I was attracted by this potential conversation with contemporary divine command ethicists like John Hare and and Alston and Robert Adams and so on. And so my interest in that tradition, I suppose, drove me as I developed this doctoral project to frame the work in a similar way, as an attempt to put together an argument for divine command theory from within those traditions. But the downside of that is that we don't see much of the subtleties, for example, even within the schools that I study. So we don't see what happens, we don't see much of what happens with Ghazali and Fakhruddin al-Razi and so on, and we don't see what happens with, after Abu Hussein al-Basri. And my kind of basic sense is that the traditions, the Baqillani, Juwayni, as opposed to their, and Abdul Jabbar on the other side, in a way they were uncompromising in their statement of their own schools doctrines, and gradually we see schools learning from one another over time. And again, that goes back to the fact that knowledge is developed within a discourse, within a social discourse. There is no other way of doing it, really. So this is missing. This is not something that is on the horizon for me immediately. I'm planning, some work on theories of legal purpose and legal maxims in the post-classical tradition at the moment. But this conversation like this sort of helps me think through what directions could come in the future, and if we have more conversations of that nature, then maybe that would crystallize in another project in the future. I think you're muted, Professor.
I'm muted, sorry. So I was going to, okay, let me allow Professor Attar to ask the last question for the session.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, Dr. Omar, actually, I read not your book, I read your dissertation when it was first online. And I love that dissertation because I was aware that you were heading somewhere, that you are aware of the divine command theorist like John Hare and the one that you mentioned. And I was thinking that maybe you are trying to develop divine command theory in those lines. But it doesn't seem to me, from what we have read in the last paper, that you are not really following that project. You are not really trying to develop or come with a kind of a different divine command theory. So my question is actually, I'm sure that maybe you are aware of an article that was recently published, maybe in religious ethics or something like this, by Malik, Dr. Malik, and in that article, he is arguing that maybe those Christian divine command theorists have a lot to learn from Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, and he was interpreting Abu Hamid al-Ghazali to be willing to bite the bullet. I think that the article is, even the title is Biting the Bullet. And what is the bullet here? This is to fully accept that divine commands, and like, of course, you know that divine command is something and divine command theory is something else. So he was arguing that actually Abu Hamid al-Ghazali was willing to bite the bullet and accept that divine commands are arbitrary. I found that article problematic, and I find that, like, if Muslims start like going that way, So like, how can we relate to each other? How can we relate to the world? How can we even think ethically if we say that divine commands are arbitrary? Anyways, like, I even don't agree with that interpretation of Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali is the one who talked about the divine purposes theory, al-Maqasid al-Sharia. So I agree with you that the version developed in Ashʿarī theology, whether it is al-Shāṭibī, whom Dr. Muhammad studied, Dr. Muhammad Mas'ud, and other great Muslim theologians, they didn't have that simplified divine command theory as depicted in that article, willing to bite the bullet. But like, what would you say to somebody?
So this is Dr. Shuaib.
Exactly.
Shuaib Malik. So I know of the article. I haven't read it yet, so I can't really speak.
Oh, please do. Oh, please
okay.
do. Says like that he's interpreting Al-Ghazali as accepting like the arbitrary divine commands, although like you are definitely aware that Al-Ghazali is the one who came up with the like divine purposes, Maqasid al-Sharia, so the commands here cannot be arbitrary. So I am really looking forward to see like maybe some Turkish scholars are also working with the same project, like developing a kind of divine command theory that is not that where divine commands are not seen as arbitrary.
Are not seen as arbitrary. Yes. Well, I mean, I will say I'm glad that people are doing projects of that nature. Even though I like you, I do not. I think there is a distinction between being aware of the limits of what human minds can achieve and arbitrariness. And I think it's an important distinction. And this is a question I get often in conferences. And again, I think this is a reflection of a certain ingrained assumption about, it's either God is a human-like being that thinks like us, just knows everything, but we don't. Or everything falls apart. Well, I think that's a false dichotomy. I think in the Ashʿarī thought, the claim is very clearly not that divine commands are arbitrary. Divine commands make perfect sense within the broader divine design. It's just that we don't understand it. Just because you're incapable of fully grasping something doesn't make it illogical or incoherent or arbitrary. And so this is sort of a basic point that I think divine command theorists should insist on, that being aware of the limits of our knowledge is not the same thing as to say that what is beyond our knowledge is incoherent or doesn't make sense. And so I'm not commenting on the article itself because I still have to read it, but I'm commenting on the many times this claim of arbitrariness has been raised, and I don't agree with it. I don't think that the Ghazali or any other Ash'ari in the classical tradition actually held that divine commands are arbitrary.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. I really want to thank Dr. Professor Omar Farahat for joining us, for sharing your paper with us, and also then presenting in a kind of very lucid and a very interesting way. I think your paper has raised a lot of questions and interests, and I think that it is also an invitation to look again at the tradition. And I think it is also sort of an extra bonus, or at least significant part of your work is also to think about what that implies for contemporary discussions as well. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you perhaps in better times when we overcome some of the COVID, that we will find an opportunity to actually meet in person. But I think your paper has made a significant contribution to our discussion, and the series of lectures that we organize, I think, has brought up the issues that you are raising as well. So
thank you very much, and thanks for all the valuable comments and questions. It's been quite an honor to participate in the seminar.